Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 20th video of the Old Testament survey course. In this video, we're going to examine the biblical book of Ruth, and we'll start with some background issues. First is the authorship of the book of Ruth. The book is technically anonymous, and so we don't know who wrote it. Whoever it was, they were a masterful storyteller, because this book is a literary masterpiece. The way it tells the story brilliantly highlights its theological message. Now let's talk about the place of the book of Ruth in the Bible. In the English Bible, in the book order that you're used to, Ruth comes right after the book of Judges, because Ruth happens during the time of Judges. Ruth describes a pocket of faithfulness during unfaithful times. And this book bridges the historical gap between the Judges and King David. But in the Hebrew Bible, which you'll remember has the same books, but sometimes in a different order, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth is right after the book of Proverbs. What do you think is the significance of this? Well, think about how the book of Proverbs ends. What is in Proverbs chapter 31? Well, it's the poem of the virtuous wife, also known as the woman of valor. After you've read the woman of valor in Proverbs 31, what's the next thing that you'll read in the Hebrew Bible? The book of Ruth. You see, Ruth is a concrete illustration of the Proverbs 31 woman of virtue. And then Ruth is followed by the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible. And I'll leave that to you to connect those dots. And the book of Ruth looks forward to and prepares the way for King David. This is God providentially preparing for the birth of the King of Israel. And with all the biblical narratives, God is the hero of the book of Ruth. You see, it's not just Ruth's working or doing or Ruth's character, but it's God's. So the point of the book is not just to imitate Ruth or Boaz in their faithfulness, which we should, but the main point is to see God working and stand in awe of God and trust God in our own lives. Now let's shift and talk about the organization of the book. The outline of Ruth, like Exodus and Numbers, is by the physical setting. And in Ruth, the locations are not only the actual places where the events took place, but they also have symbolic significance. And in Ruth, the 4 locations correspond to the 4 chapter breaks. In the first chapter, they go to Moab and back. They move away from the promised land full, and then go back to the promised land empty. And yet, Ruth comes to the promised land for the first time. Then chapter 2 takes place gleaning in the fields, in the agricultural fields. This is the place where working for fruitfulness happens. Then in chapter 3 takes place at the threshing floor. That is the place of the harvest, the place where the fruitfulness is enjoyed. And then finally, chapter 4, redemption takes place at the city gate, which is the place of decision and legal finality. Now we'll look at the content of the book. Here's some key verses of Ruth. First, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, which says, Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Now, this passage is important because it describes the conversion of Ruth. She is leaving her people and her gods, and she's committing to the people of the God of Israel. And she even takes her oath in the name of Yahweh. And the next key verse is chapter 2, verse 3. And it says, "So Ruth went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." Now you might be thinking, well, why is this a key verse? Well, in the big picture of the story, an apparently random event of going to this particular field, it put her in the place to meet Boaz, who's going to play a big part in the rest of the book. But the way the author phrases this, it is clearly implied this is not a random event. It's kind of like saying, well, as it turned out, as it so happened to take place, wink, wink. See, the author makes it very clear, points out that God's fingerprints are all over this seemingly random event, which wasn't really random. Because God is working in the lives of Ruth and Naomi beyond what they could see or what they could even imagine. Next is chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. Now, this is after Ruth had met Boaz, and he was gracious to her. It says, "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.'" Now, this passage is a confirmation of Ruth's conversion and character. And it's also a pronouncement of blessing on her because she has been faithful to her mother-in-law and because she has taken refuge with the Lord. God will repay her blessing with blessing, just like the promise to Abraham. And then chapter 3, verse 11, where Boaz says to Ruth, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character." In this verse, Boaz promises to redeem Ruth and Naomi's family. But he also publicly acknowledges that she is a woman of noble character. Now, earlier, he was called a man of noble character. So she's now proclaimed to be the same social status as he is. And notice how her social status grows throughout the story by the title she's given. I mean, she starts off as the Moabitess, the foreigner. Then she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. And then she is a woman of noble character. And at the end of the book, she's compared to the mothers of Israel, Rachel and Leah and Tamar. Then finally, chapter 4, verse 14. "The women said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel.'" Now, this passage brings closure to one of the threads of the story. You see, Naomi had earlier complained that God had forsaken and forgotten her. See, God's character was tested in Naomi's life. But by the end of the story, the whole town proclaimed that the Lord had come through big time. God had not left her without a redeemer to restore all that she had lost and more. And they prayed that her redeemer would be famous, which came true. And now let's walk through the plot of the Book of Ruth. In the first scene, Naomi moves to Moab and then returns. She moves from the promised land with her husband and 2 sons. They're trying to find a better life in Moab, away from a famine in the land. But symbolically, leaving the promised land is always bad. Now her two sons each marry a Moabite woman, and then her husband and both her sons die, leaving Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. Then Naomi starts back to the promised land. Now when she gets there, she tells people not to call her Naomi anymore, because Naomi means pleasant. She says, call me Mara, because Mara means bitter. She's complaining that God has forsaken her. And I understand, she's lost her husband and both her sons. But on the way back, she tells her daughters-in-law to leave her and go back to Moab. Orpah forsakes Naomi and goes back. But Ruth refuses to go back. She goes beyond what is socially required, and she remains devoted to her mother-in-law. She commits to her new people and her new God. And the next scene takes place in the grain fields. Ruth and Naomi need a way to support themselves, so Ruth goes into the fields to glean behind the harvesters. Now, gleaning is an ancient method of charity for the poor. And the farmer did not harvest all of the field, but left some for the poor to pick up. And by the way, this is a great lesson for modern charity, in that it demonstrates a middle ground between just giving welfare, which robs people of initiative and dignity, and the other side just forsaking them, leaving them to fend for themselves. It gives them a way to help themselves. I know it's an old cliche, but it's still wise that the church should give a hand up and not just a hand out. So Ruth, she goes to the field to glean, and she just happens to go to a field owned by Boaz. As she'll find out later, Boaz is related to Naomi's dead husband, and he is in a position to help them by the law of redemption by a kinsman. And Boaz shows Ruth favor, gives her grain, and protects her. Naomi then hears about this, and she rejoices. This brings us to the third chapter, at the threshing floor. Naomi takes it upon herself to play matchmaker for Ruth, to find a place for Ruth. And so she plans a setup for Ruth. Basically, Ruth proposes to Boaz. And then Ruth follows the instructions that Naomi gave her. Now, by the way, there's nothing sleazy about what Ruth does in this chapter. What she does is upright and virtuous, even if it is kind of bold and forward. And Boaz responds favorably. He will do what Ruth asks. He will take care of them. Because Ruth has proven herself to be a faithful woman of virtue. But Boaz mentions a kinsman who is a closer relative and who therefore needs to be given a chance to redeem first. And Boaz blesses Ruth, and he sent her away to Naomi with abundant food for them both. And then the last scene takes place at the city gate, in front of all the elders, so the decision is official and legal. And this unnamed kinsman, he declines to help. And so Boaz commits to marry Ruth and to take care of Naomi and her family. And Boaz and Ruth are married and eventually have a child. And Naomi is blessed, and she's full because of all that God had done for her. And this leads to the genealogy of David, because their child will eventually be David's grandfather. And they all lived happily ever after. So now let's look at the themes of Ruth. The first theme is covenant faithfulness. The Hebrew word chesed is a key word in this book. In most translations, it's translated kindness. In key verses like chapter 1, verse 8, 2, 20, and chapter 3, verse 10. But the word means faithfulness, faithfulness to the covenant, loving kindness in doing what is right, Ruth shows faithfulness to Naomi by not leaving her. Boaz shows faithfulness to Ruth and Naomi by taking care of them. The town of Bethlehem is faithful in a time of unfaithfulness, taking their vows and giving their blessings in the name of Yahweh. But most importantly, God is faithful to his people. In this book, especially to Naomi, even when she was complaining because the promises were tested, she said, I'm empty. But God came through for her because he is faithful, full of chesed. And by the way, chesed is the Hebrew word used in the famous passage we looked at earlier in Exodus 34:6, where God reveals his name, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and chesed. Then the second theme is faithfulness by contrast. That is, this covenant faithfulness is demonstrated by contrast with other characters. For instance, Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, she went back to her family. Now, when she did that, she did nothing wrong. Remember, Naomi told her to do so. But this makes Ruth's sacrifice of faithfulness look even more heroic because she didn't have to do it. In the same way, Boaz is shown in contrast with the unnamed kinsman to highlight the faithfulness which Boaz did to them. And then the third theme is God's behind-the-scenes sovereign covenant faithfulness. Now, God is rarely mentioned in the book of Ruth, but he is all over this book. You see, in Exodus and Joshua, God shows up by parting the water and doing miraculous things. But there are no dramatic miracles in Ruth. Does that mean God is not at work? No, not at all. It's just in this book, God is working behind the scenes to perfectly bring about his purposes to bless Ruth and Naomi through the seemingly random things which are guided by God's hand. And he does that through them to bless the nation. Now, keep this in mind in your own life. Just because you don't always see God at work doesn't mean he's not working. That means we don't necessarily need to demand a miracle every day for God to be with us. It's up to him to decide when to do miracles and when to work behind the scenes. But we need to trust he's always working, sometimes even through the smallest things, to bring about big things. Because he's always faithful. And that leads us to the last theme, which is David. The genealogy of David at the end of the book might seem like an afterthought to Ruth, but it's actually one of the main reasons for the book. You see, in the Bible, we're told the birth narrative of many key leaders, such as Moses, Samson, John the Baptist, and of course, Jesus. Well, the book of Ruth is the birth narrative of David. An apparently insignificant story of an immigrant who converts to Yahweh leads to the greatest king of Israel, and eventually to the King of Kings. See, there's no small stories when God is involved. So now let's review. First, the organization of Ruth. Remember that Ruth is organized by the 4 locations, and they are Moab and back, in the field, at the threshing floor, and at the city gate. And then the 4 themes of Ruth, they are covenant faithfulness, contrast faithfulness, God's sovereign faithfulness, and David. Well, that's the summary of the book of Ruth. I hope it was both informative and inspirational. We'll see how the story moves forward from here in the next historical book of 1 Samuel when we look at the next section. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.